everybody, and welcome to the Probe Dental Podcast. Today, we're joined by Luke Moore, Director at Dental Elite. Luke, how are you?
Yeah, great, thank you.
Excellent. Keeping very busy. We're here today to talk about the 2025 Dental Elite Goodwill report. I think, first of all, for those who aren't familiar, would you be able to kind of give us a rundown of what the Goodwill report is?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we released two reports. Well, we actually released three reports a year now. The benchmarking report, which we released in September, and then we released an interim report around sort of October, November time, which covers the first 6 months of the fiscal year. And then we released this second report in May time, which covers the whole of the last fiscal year and looks at every single dental practice transaction that we've acted on and what it sold for, what the multiple is, who it sold for, what its income composition was, to kind of give you a sort of a real lowdown of sort of what the movements are in the M&A market.
Fantastic. So obviously reading through this year's one, which we'll link to in the episode description here so anybody listening or watching this can easily find. The report this year highlighted that 69.88% of transactions were completed by independent buyers. So what would you say is driving this, and what advice would you give to someone who's perhaps looking to make their first acquisition in the current market?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the first thing to point out is that statistic hasn't really moved materially. I think a lot of people have the perception that actually in most of the M&A market now is corporate consolidation, but actually that isn't the case. That sort of 30%, give or take, has remained the case for the last few number of years. Now, obviously, the report only covers transactions which Dental Elite act on, but as kind of one of the market leaders, we think we've got a fair flavour as to sort of what's going on. But I guess in terms of sort of that sort of 70% in sort of what's going on in the independent market, I think there's a number of factors, because it's fair to say that the volume of transactions overall this year is significantly up on the previous year, where I think there was a lot more uncertainty in terms of what was going on with interest rates. I think the beauty we've got going into this year is that now I think there's an acceptance that interest rates are now falling, and will continue to fall, or if they don't fall, they're certainly not going to go up. Because of all the issues to do with Trump and inflation and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's sort of one factor. The second factor, I think, is that, as obviously the market's generally got tougher, I think cost of living, a lot of people now sort of remortgaging off their sort of lower fixed rate. It's still dental practice stability still remains absolutely key. That whilst there are now some practices who are noticing a bit more white space than prior, is actually generally speaking, the vast majority of dental businesses are still doing really well, which means it's a sector that a lot of people want to continue to invest in.
Excellent. So that sort of stability, both in dentistry itself and obviously in the market, is kind of helping confidence to, I guess, sort of kind of bounce back. If not,
Yeah, I guess the one thing we had is that in dental we haven't really had a dip. So even whilst a lot of businesses, be it retail or restaurants or whatever, did have the real sort of failings of COVID, apart from the obvious lockdown, dental practices bounced back very, very strongly and haven't really been too affected by what's been going on in interest rate markets. Whilst the M&A side of dentistry has been affected, it's sort of on the ground performance of the dental businesses actually, if anything, has strengthened rather than weakened over the last few years.
I suppose that's the great thing about being in such a necessary industry. So the report also indicated that sort of mixed practices are sort of continuing to achieve the highest average multiples. Why do you think kind of having that mix of NHS and private is so attractive to buyers? And kind of are there any specific trends that sellers should be aware of to maximise their value?
Yeah, I think there's another thing. The first thing I think to point out is the fact that obviously what we determine as a mixed practice is anything that's sort of greater than 80% is basically the middle. So anything that's greater than 80% NHS we determine is an NHS practice. Anything that's greater than 80% private we determine as a private practice, and everything in between is mixed. But I think the first thing to point out is that most predominantly NHS practices now probably are starting to fall more into the mixed category than they were. It's quite unusual now to find a successful NHS practice that isn't doing 20% of their income on a private basis, because actually that's often where a lot of the sort of key profitability is unlocked. So I think the first thing to say is that a really successful NHS practices are now much scarcer than perhaps they were historically. And I think then going on to why people like mixed practices over, maybe more private practice. I think, when sort of all sorts then done, the NHS label does bring patients through the door, and I think most people recognise that it does give you a strong footfall, consistently through the practice. Because even if people perceive they want NHS dentistry, a lot of them then go on to have private dentistry, when all of the options are explained to them. And the second thing is, I think, is cash flows. I think, again, when you're buying a business, particularly that sort of independent sector, where you're putting your own neck on the line, you're giving personal guarantees to the bank that the loan's going to be repaid. Having the even if you don't particularly like working on the NHS, having the idea that you've got an NHS contract that gives you the sustainability of the income does mean that you've got a lot more security. And I think it's mindfulness more than anything else.
Absolutely, that makes perfect sense. I mean, we're also seeing significant growth in private revenues with practices that were once predominantly NHS. So obviously that explains, as you said, the size of the mixed practice category. But do you think the shift towards sort of more private income is sustainable? Obviously, you mentioned how NHS helps drive that kind of initial traffic through. Think it will influence practice valuations, and do you think kind of the NHS is kind of sort of here to stay and will stick around, or do you think there is a market kind of a way towards sort of fully private? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I think it all sort of seems to be what happens with NHS contract reform. Obviously, the Welsh contract reform is going through a period at the moment where there's lots of information out in the marketplace, and it's not being particularly very well received by the practitioners. So I guess it depends how much is imposed on practices as to how much NHS work they continue to do. But I guess in terms of the movement, generally speaking, I mean, yeah, a lot more people are acceptable now to taking on private dentistry, and I think part of that is because you've got a lot more employers who offer packages that support people with claiming back the NHS fees, and also whilst in your NHS patient charge revenue. So most people, again, I think in the population, there's a bit of a misconception that NHS dentistry is free at the point of delivery, and for the vast majority, they are paying for their NHS dentistry, and they have to pay obviously one of the banded rates in order to receive it. Now, for a lot of people. Now, the actual difference between what you're paying for an NHS checkup and what you're paying for a private checkup isn't that vast. So when the options are explained to people from a pricing perspective, a lot of people are opting to go for private dentistry because they perceive that actually it's only a little bit more expensive, and often it's more accessible because, of course, we still have dental deserts right across the UK where you can't access an NHS dentistry, so they've been forced to go private. But I guess the counter argument to that is that what we have had is we have had a load of practices who have looked to convert their NHS lists over the last few years, and those NHS contracts haven't really been retendered. So you've got a lot of people, particularly up in the northeast, where at the moment you can't get an NHS dentist, so their hand is almost being forced to go private. So I guess the counter argument to will private dentistry continue to grow is a lot of these contracts are now starting to be retendered, and it's whether those practices maintain their patient base or whether a lot of people, when they're given the option, do migrate back to NHS dentistry. But of course, even still, they're still, those practices that are being retendered and winning the contracts are still at the mercy of how much access they can actually give, because often, quite frustratingly with existing practitioners, when they're being retendered at a much higher UDA rate, which means that the same pot of money doesn't go quite as far as it did. Also, we have, of course, had some amendments to the NHS contract and UDA system, which means that it's easier to achieve your UDAs now than it was historically. And so, again, that reduces access. And you've got the age-old problem of the fact, can you find a dentist to deliver any of it in the first place anyway? So actually, generally speaking, if you said a practice who gave up their NHS contract for, say, treating 5,000 patients, in truth now they're only going to be able to deliver 3,000 patients, give or take, if they're fully staffed anyway. And that's if they can find a dentist to deliver the contract. So I think we still will see a migration towards private dentistry. And I think a lot of us believe that ultimately we're going to go to a core system of NHS dentistry, which probably means that a lot of the fee-paying adults who currently receive NHS dentistry probably wouldn't, cease to be entitled in the longer term. Either that or they'll be entitled, but actually what they won't realise is they're paying for 98% of it anyway, by means of the increase in patient charge revenue. Which means that I think a lot of practices will then start to take the view that actually as they educate patients, they will move them onto a private plan or similar, so they've got the guarantee of the inflow without all of the politics associated with NHS dentistry. But that's all. I guess that's all pie in the sky stuff. I think to answer your question directly is that do I think we'll still see a gradual movement towards private dentistry? Yes. I think buyers will probably still like the idea of income security, so be that a dental plan or be that NHS. I think that will still drive some people not to give up their NHS contract, because ultimately that will mean that they're still more attractive to the market. And equally, what I wouldn't advise any principal to do is, if you're 3 or 4 years away from sale, then you shouldn't really be looking at making massive changes to, to the kind of income composition you've got. We deal with a lot of people who've been advised to give up their NHS contract, or have given up their NHS contract, for a political reason. Yet they're only 2 years away from sale, and when we come in, when they come to market and say, well, actually, as it stands at the moment, you're not a sellable asset, because the practice is in a state of flux, and until you can demonstrate to someone what the income actually looks like and how many patients you're actually treating, then actually you can't really sell the asset.
I think you made some very interesting points then, just sort of going back to the kind of, sort of adults on the NHS. And you do sort of wonder sometimes actually whether, I mean, I know this is a little bit off topic, but whether kind of providing access to, I suppose, more children might be beneficial. There's a lot of talk about the kind of crisis of, I think the number one cause of children going under general anaesthetic is due to poor oral health and caries. So I think you could have stumbled on something there, but yeah.
To be fair, I think a lot of practices, that's the reason why they retain their NHS contracts, is because it does mean they can treat the children and be paid for it. Because a lot of private practices now, are now sort of trying to work out what the best way is to treat children. Because whilst adults, quite sometimes will accept they'll pay for private dentistry, for some reason, then it's the total inverse of everything else we do in our lives, where we often prioritise our children and we'll pay for our children above paying for ourselves. When it comes to dentistry, a lot of people will prioritise putting the children on NHS, and then often for convenience as much as anything else, they'll attend the same practice as what their child attends. And so if you've got a practice that's done a full private conversion, and you've no longer got an NHS contract for children, some people take the option to treat the children for free. Some people do a very sort of modestly priced plan for the children, so it locks in the parents. But then a lot of people have found that historically, where an NHS practice opens up, they lose the children back to the NHS practice, and sometimes they run the risk of losing mum and dad as well.
It's interesting. Be interested to keep kind of track of that as the years go on. So obviously, going back to the report as well, it shows that the average practice price is approaching £1.3 million. So considering various factors that influence valuation, how can sellers ensure that they achieve a realistic valuation for their practice? And what are the sort of key, KPIs, the key performance indicators they should focus on to, improve maximising their value?
Yeah, but I think one of the big things that has changed probably in the last 10 years is that whereas before people would buy a practice and they would look to impose their own cost benchmarking in how they were modelling the practice, they only impose their own cost benchmarking now as if they think they can't run it as cheaply as you're running it, and they actually think the profit's going to go down. So any changes you make to your practice which make the costs more expensive, will carry forward into the valuation. And I guess there's four sort of key cost areas that people need to focus on, because overheads in the main you can't do a great deal about. So the first is materials and lab fees or share costs, and some of that is down to bookkeeping as much as anything else. So where you've got an expense that would traditionally be a shared cost going forward, be that an implant fee or be that an orthodontic appliance, that needs to be separately itemised in accounts in order for it to carry forward in the valuation in the correct method. The second is staff costs, which is probably the biggest bugbear at the moment, with the changes in both national living wage and employers' national insurance. And the third, also the fourth and final one, which is probably the biggest one, is associate fees. I think there's lots of mood music at the moment, particularly on some of the Facebook groups that I'm part of, with associates sort of kicking back a bit about what they're paid and how they should continue to be paid 50% of gross fees. Whereas I think what's happened is over the last sort of few months, particularly, where there's been big increases in overheads, particularly around staff costs. A lot of principals, when they've re-recruited or are starting to have discussions around actually that 50% isn't a viable expense going forward. But actually, as I said, that's why when you're recruiting as a principal, you need to make sure you're recruiting at the right percentage. And that also isn't just necessarily the fee split, but also how you work out the hygiene recharge, particularly for plan practices or for plan patients, because that's something which can make massive impacts on the value of your practice. So to give by way of example, if you recruited and for a book that say was generating say 200,000 a year, and you're paying out 50%, that's 100 grand. Now, if you're paying out 45%, then all of a sudden that becomes significantly cheaper and you're paying out, say, 95 grand. So you've got that sort of 5 grand saving there. But when you're selling your practice for, say, 7 times EBITDA, that 5 grand then becomes 35 grand in practice valuation terms. And of course, you can pound that over the, a practice that's, say, turning over £1 million. All of a sudden, you've got massive differences in valuation for what is a relatively simple mistake that could be made when someone's recruiting.
You mentioned EBITDA. Is it EBITDA? I didn't know if it was EBITDA or so. Obviously, earnings. So earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Have I got that correct?
100%. Bang on.
Oh, I tried to remember what we started. I wasn't 100% sure how you said it because yeah, you ask Google and everyone has a different answer for that.
Yeah, I think that's
Um,
the truth. I think as long as you know what it is, I don't think it matters how you pronounce it. To be perfectly
no,
honest.
EBITDA.
Yeah.
So obviously, yeah, the Goodwill report sort of highlights the regional variations of EBITDA, and I was just wondering if you could describe and explain how location of a practice. Obviously, you mentioned sort of the northeast earlier, and talk about NHS. Kind of how the location of the practice impacts its value, as well as what opportunities or challenges you're seeing in specific regions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to go off on a slight tangent ahead of that is you'll notice that in the report this year is that it's broken down into the two types of sales. So sales to groups, which do focus on EBITDA, and then sales to independents, which is that 69.88% you mentioned at the outset. Where actually the valuation methodology uses I would say a different type of EBITDA, but we talk about it in terms of fair maintainable trade, and that's quite a different figure to EBITDA, because when you're looking at fair maintainable trade, you're looking at building building in the cost of a full-time principal. So it means you'll have a higher profit figure to start with, because there'll be at least, say, 9 sessions a week where we're assuming a principal dentist will take over. So again, it's when people talk about EBITDA and talk about EBITDA multiples, it's really important that you're comparing apples with apples, because if not, you can get some very sort of out there assumptions and valuation which don't represent kind of really what's kind of going on. Um, and I think that that's probably testament in the report, because you'll see that if you look at what the bigger group sports and the tier ones and tier twos, their average practice purchase was somewhere in the region of sort of 3.2 million plus. Whereas if you look at the sales to independents, where we talk about fair and maintainable trade, the average sale was about 795 grand. So there is almost two sort of micro markets going on. And they are both impacted by sort of the regional variations, because to be fair, there's a direct link between where you've got a strong populace of dentists, and be that's where the dentists that live there or where there's no recruitment challenges, against where you haven't got those kind of challenges. So the strongest areas of the UK are kind of what you mentioned, and what a lot of people would expect: so the northwest, London and southeast, Midlands. Whereas you've got areas like, for argument's sake, the southwest peninsula, where multiples, if you talk about it in terms of EBITDA terms, about probably 0.6, 0.7 of turn lower than the rest of the more popular areas, and you've got a similar kind of thing going on in the northeast. Now, I guess the one thing to say is that I guess sort of playing with statistics per se, but we include Essex and Hertfordshire in our central region, which also includes Norfolk and Suffolk. So you probably would include Norfolk and Suffolk in those if we wrote them down as a separate region. But because of how we itemise the region, it looks like the eastern coast doesn't sort of values are higher than maybe it actually does in reality, because of how the regions are grouped. Whereas obviously the southwest isn't quite as well protected. And I guess the other thing to mention is that this is a report purely on what practices have sold. So whilst at the moment you look at the southwest and you go, oh, that's not too bad, 0.6 if the turn lower. Actually, that's because, if we're honest, a lot of national health practices or in the southwest just aren't selling at all. So what that means is that actually the multiple in some respects is somewhat inflated, because those practices aren't trading particularly as regularly as they were in previous years. And then I guess the other region probably to focus on is Scotland, because Scotland has got a different challenge altogether. Now, the Scottish market arguably has always been sort of 2 or 3 years behind what the rest of the English market is doing, and I think that's still the case, because certainly the Scottish market is going through what I would call a bit of a price correction at the moment. the Scottish market got inflated somewhat, where you had sort of a number of consolidators up there in the sector, be that Clive Monroe, be that Real Good Dental, as well as some of the more national consolidators, and then some more bespoke regional consolidators. But you've got both Clive Monroe and Real Good Dental who are in the stage at the moment where they're definitely not acquiring for all of the reasons that I won't talk about on this podcast, but I think are mostly well known in the sector. And then equally, you've got a Portman Dentex merger, who were two of the national consolidators were up there. My dentists who were very quiet. So as a region, you haven't got any real big consolidators who are consolidating in the Scottish space, and a lot of that is because people are apprehensive of recruitment, they're apprehensive of the Scottish system, and I think a lot of Scottish practices tend to be smaller. And a lot of the bigger groups, as alluded to my sort of earlier stat about what the average purchase price was for sort of the tier ones and tier twos, they're just simply not hitting the kind of revenues where they make sense for a lot of the big corporate consolidators to consider, unless they're in that central belt. So it's a very, very small market in Scotland, and at the moment that's allowing the lower tier consolidators, so those with anywhere from sort of 3 to 20 practices, to buy practices a lot more cheaply. And they're certainly at the moment, given the abundance of choice that they've got, not going to sort of really float that market or pump that market until one of the national or big regional consolidators comes back.
Brilliant. Well, there's plenty more we could be talking about from the report, but obviously I'm quite conscious, obviously, of your time. And just if anyone was wondering why Drill went off earlier, Luke's very kindly joined us while sort of out and about, and I would stop at a garage. So I really appreciate you taking the time here. For anybody listening, watching, how's the best way they can get in touch if they need to? Obviously, we'll include the link to the report, but
yeah, I mean, obviously, if you attend our website, all of the contact details of the various valuers are on there, so you can always drop us a call or an email, whatever works best.
Fantastic. Well, no, as I say, once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
No problem at all. Thanks, James.